Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Oxygen for the Soul. This week's Parsha is Parashat Vayera, and we're in middle of a long story speaking about Abraham, and it started with last week's Parsha. I want you to go ahead and I want you to travel. I want you to go to the land that I will show you. I want you to leave your father's home. I want you to leave the country that you were born in, and I want you to find the strength to start anew. And where do you begin? By looking within the self. Lech lecha. I want you to go for whom? For you. This it wasn't just a trip, a vacation. It wasn't just a way for him to go ahead and travel. It was a way for him to discover the greatest aspects of who he is as a person. And if you haven't read last week's parsha, I recommend reading it because it's an important segue into this week's parsha. This week's parsha begins with the famous pasuk Vayera elav Hashem, and God appeared to him where Be'alone Mamre, in the fields and in the plains of Mamre. Who was Mamre? Mamre was an interesting guy. And the Midrash says that the reason why we're actually mentioning his name over here is because he's the guy that gave advice to Abraham about the Brit Milah. And because of that, he gave him good advice on how to do the Brit Milah. He is mentioned over here. But there's something strange over here. Pasuk says, Vayera elav Hashem be'alone Mamre. And God appeared to, doesn't say whom, to him, in the fields of Mamre, in the plains of Mamre. Hu yashab bepetach ohel kechom hayam. And he sat at the entrance of the tent, looking out for, Rashi says, for travelers. He wanted to do chesed at the heat of the day. Why couldn't the pasuk simply just say, Vayera elav Hashem el Abraham be'alone Mamre? Couldn't add the extra words. We have to go ahead and figure it out. Why isn't Abraham's name mentioned over here? It's a strange introduction to the parasha. And it's interesting because Rashi doesn't even ask the question. Rashi says, Vayera alav. What does the word Vayera alav mean? He says, Levaker et choleh. God came and appeared to Abraham in order to visit the sick. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, right? Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, Yom Shlishi lemilato haya. This is the third day of the Milah. Uba Kadosh Baruch Hu v'shelo v'shlomo. And God came to go ahead and see how he was doing. God knew how he was doing. Okay, he was in pain. The third day of the Brit Milah is supposed to be the most painful of the whole entire process. And therefore, on the day that Abraham was in the most amount of pain, this is the day that Hashem comes to visit Abraham. Great. Why can't we mention his name? By Parshat Noach, the Parsha begins with, the Noach, Ela told Noach tzaddik, ish tzaddik tamim haya b'derotav. Very clear, description of his name and his accomplishments, but yet over here with Abraham, nothing, silent. And the question is why? And I have a couple of answers here. I want to share. I'm going to share one that I think is relevant. Okay, so he ends up. The Kedushat Levi says that the reason why Abraham's name is not mentioned is because after the Brit Milah, Abraham reaches a new level. And his name is no longer mentioned because at this point, he's able to break away from the thing that confines him. What's the thing that confines all of us? Our nature. Our names, the Kedushat Levi says, is a letter configuration that is somehow tied to our mazal, tied to our fortune. And the way Abraham was born, according to the natural alignment of the stars, he was not in a position to ever have a child. He was incapable of producing any children. But now that that Abraham is involved in this Brit Milah, if you think about it, what the Brit Milah is, a Brit Milah, the circumcision, is pulling back the foreskin of a very personal area, the area that represents the future, the area that represents future generations. So he literally removes a part of that skin to expose the deepest parts of what he really is. Who is Abraham? Abraham is the man, the first man that is able to conquer the self. And I speak about this all the time, and it's always worth repeating. We all have a baseline program that defines who we are. And then the question is, when are we really expressing who we are? Are we expressing who we are when things are going okay, where there's no stress, where things are even, where the sun is out and there's no pressure? Or are you able to go ahead and discover who a person is in those moments of challenge. And maybe this is why when the Gemara says, if you want to understand who a person is, go ahead and inspect him bekiso, bekaso, right? Ubekoso. The three places you could go ahead and test a person is how he drinks, how he holds his liquor, right? Number two is how he spends his money, and three is how he gets angry. These are the three different ways of understanding the nature of a person. Why are those areas? Is that really fair? Some financial constraints. You're under the influence. You got upset. Why are those the areas to check the nature of a person? And I think what the Gemara means is that it's in those areas where the bandwidth is really low that you actually get to see the core of who a human being is. I remember many years ago when I was dating my wife, back in the dating days, and we had gone out. Our first date was November 17th, 1997, Tuesday, and we went out like 5 or 6 times. She had winter break, and she went back to Cleveland, and then so she was gone for 4 weeks. We had like there was no Zoom phone calls, no Zoom dating. We had phone calls, and I remember I had to get like a national plan of the phone, and making those phone calls were expensive, but we were investing for the future. And I remember the date that she came back on. It was like 3 days before she came back. I was driving to yeshiva early in the morning, and a car. I was driving up Kings Highway, and Kings Highway turns off on like East 21st. It becomes Avenue P. It's 2 lanes. I pull over. I want to pull into a spot. The car behind me rear ends me, pushes me so hard into like oncoming traffic. I have to swerve out of the way, and I crash into a tree. So the back of my car is smashed. The front of my car is smashed. So thank God it wasn't too serious. My car was totaled. I got very lucky. And 3 days later, I'm on a date with my wife. So I have a rental car. So we go out on a date. We're somewhere downtown. We were like in the village. And we went out for some tea and played some games, whatever it is. And we had a very intense conversation. We're walking back to the car. And we're walking, and I get a sense, like sometimes like maybe you missed the car. You were too engrossed in the conversation. And like the car was way behind. I'm like, I think we went too far. We have to go back. We go back and forth. Can't find the car. And I remember where I parked the car. I remember, oh, this is the house. This is the tree. We parked right here. It's gone. So then we spent a whole entire thing, and it was freezing. We're talking about in January. It was the coldest day. My fingers were cold. My toes were cold. There's no car. You're outside. You're in Manhattan. We're going into a cab. The cab driver we have is just moved from India to America like 2 days ago. He has no idea where he's going. We want to go to the police. We want to go to the precinct. We try to find the car. Maybe the car was stolen. Maybe it was towed. I have no idea. We finally get to the precinct. The precinct is packed. There's crazy people all over the place. We finally speak to the sergeant. Okay, it's late. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning already, right? So then the sergeant tells us, listen, you have to go to the west side. It's in Pier 46. Your car was towed. So we get into a train, and the train is delayed, and this and that, and the whole entire time, my wife tells me this after the fact, that one of the things I noticed is that during this whole entire thing, you never lost your cool, right? And at that moment, she got a sense of what my nature was like. And the other thing that she noticed was when we got to Pier 46, we get there, they're like, sorry, you only take cash. And the closest bank is 10 blocks away in the freezing cold on the west side. So I'm like, don't worry about it. It was like $300 to get my car out. I always kept $300 in the back of my wallet, whipped it out. I was prepared. But the idea is that it's in those moments that we really get to know who and what a person is, right? Abraham is the first person that says, you know what? I'm not comfortable with what I am. I want to become something more. The reason why the Torah over here, Chachamim say, do not mention his name is simply because Abraham was no longer Abraham. He was someone else. It's interesting that the words Vayera Elav, that the whole idea of God seeing something, the first time the Torah speaks about the word Vayera is where? Vayera Hashem Ki Tov, God saw that everything he created was good. It's a very positive thing. Abraham's coming, Hashem is using the same language to see all the good that Abraham has accomplished. Where is he? He's sitting Petach HaOhel Kechom Hayom. He's sitting at the entrance of his home, gazing out into the world. Abraham is like God in this sense. He is looking out to see the good in people. He wants to see the good in people because he understands if he could inspire the world around him, he can make the world a better, greater place. There's 2 pieces that I saw this week in Rav Shamshon Ufal Hirsch. I mentioned it a couple times in some of my classes, but they're so awesome that I want to share it with you. Okay, there's 2 of them over here. We'll do we'll do this one. We'll do this one first. He says as follows, Rav Hirsch. He says, Vayera elav Hashem. He says, God appeared to him. He says, outsiders often slander Judaism and its adherents, like how to practice it. They go ahead and they besmirch the legacy of Abraham and those who inherited by falsely categorizing us. These detractors claim to understand us and say, look at the arrogance of those circumcised Hebrews parading around as they are God's chosen people. They refuse to join with others who are not as holy as they believe themselves to be. Jews lack empathy or unity with the rest of humanity. According to the Jews, God is interested only in the affairs occurring in their tiny strip of territory, to the exclusion of everything else. Is there any truth to this evaluation? Rav Hirsch asks. Look at the first circumcised Jew. He has sequestered himself. Has he sequestered himself in a cave? Has he removed himself and put himself in some faraway land? Is he completely removed from society? Is he alone in some room with God? No. Here he sits by the oaks of Mamre, eager for human interaction. He craves the company of his friends, Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, men who had been included in Abraham's covenant with God. Despite how Abraham has by now circumcised himself, his relationship with his companions has not changed. He's exactly the same person. In fact, the sages teach that Abraham, concern for others, led him to the door of his tent on that hot day. They wish to emphasize that it is more important to welcome human guests into one's home than to greet the divine presence. Rav Hirsch says, I want you to consider the three men who appeared on Abraham's doorstep. They were, of course, uncircumcised, even idolaters for all Abraham knew, yet Abraham was prepared to leave God's presence and rush out to fulfill the commandment of extending kindness to strangers. Why? Because that is exactly what God does all day. He is giving us infinite amount of chesed, infinite amount of kindness. He loves you. He cares about you. He's thinking about you. How do I know that? Because you're here listening. Your involvement in the world right now is predicated on God understanding that you, my friends, are special and you have so much you have to accomplish. You don't even realize it. There's one other Rav Hirsch, and then I'm going to tie it all together with the beginning of my statements. He says, "V'yisa einav v'yirah." Abraham looked up and saw. That's the next pasuk. Pasuk over there reads as follows. It says, "V'yisa einav v'yirah." Abraham looked up and behold, hine shlosha anashim nitzavim. There were three people that were standing. V'yar v'yirah v'yiratz. He saw it was good, and he ran. He ran from his front door. And he bowed down. He prostrated himself to them. Could you imagine if you saw a bunch of people, strangers, walking down the street? You were so excited that you get to see these people. You want to go ahead and offer them to come to your home for a drink. Who thinks like that? I remember, I used to run these outreach trips, and part of the responsibility for those trips was, part of the requirements was to bring people on Shabbatons. So I remember these were a group of Russian Jewish students, and I had to explain to them this concept of going away on a Shabbaton. But Rabbi, I don't understand why can't we just drive home? We don't keep Shabbat. Why can't we just drive home Friday night? We'll come back Saturday morning. What's the big deal? I said, no, and this and that. It's, the whole experience is not driving back. It's staying in the home, questioning these people, seeing what's like in their home, whatever it is. Well, what do they get out of it? I'm like, they're getting nothing out of it. You're not paying them to host us? I'm like, no. These people are opening up their homes just to have us. I'm like, yes. Why? What are they selling? I'm like, they're not selling anything. They're not selling anything. They love Jews. They want to have Jews in their home. They couldn't wrap their mind around the idea that a stranger would open up their house and take them in and feed them and sleep them and so on and so forth and host them. Right? It's a weird thing, but that's exactly who Abraham is. We are the descendants of a man who is obsessed with caring for humanity because he understood that's what God is doing. And if you and I are here to go ahead and hear the call of God, right? If we're here to go ahead and hear the call of God, then how are we taking care of his world? When we do that, what do we become? We become God-like. We reflect God. We create a Kiddush Hashem. And I want you to read this part over here from Rav Hirsch also. Amazing piece. Abraham looked up and he saw. One interpretation is that God revealed himself to Abraham while he was busy welcoming his guests. It's a weird place to go ahead and bring in God. He's going to go ahead and interrupt. Alternatively, Abraham walked away from his encounter with God in order to fulfill the commandment of hospitality of chesed. Either way, the episode teaches us something valuable about the nature of prophecy in Israel. This is the point. Many people confuse prophecy with magic or illusion, and they consider the experience to be one of ecstatic wonder. According to this understanding, the state of euphoria leads to prophecy, meaning that prophecy is merely one step higher than the rapture which facilitated it. There are even some Jewish philosophers who characterize the phenomena of prophecy in this way, claiming that the practice of meditation is sufficient to induce communication from above. These thinkers believe that isolation, as well as the shedding of one's personal, spatial, and intellectual awareness, can somehow summon the message from God. In truth, a yawning chasm separates that description from the true essence of prophecy, meaning you think that the whole way you get nevuah is by going in and putting yourself in some weird meditative state in the top of some ashram somewhere in the Himalayan mountains alone, taking a vow of silence. And he's saying that's a mistake. He said abstract musings cannot draw a person closer to God. Rather, key over here, the dynamic embrace of life leads one to a deeper connection with God. Let me read that again. How beautiful is that? The dynamic embrace of life leads one to a deeper connection with God. I love that. I'm like, that's going to be my quote. Furthermore, prophecy in Israel is not the product of an ailing imagination or the result of a deluded mental state. Quite the contrary, he says. God addresses people only when they are aware of the healthy mind and temperament, when they take pleasure in their work. Therefore, the Chachamim, the sages maintain that divine presence will not rest upon a person who suffers from sadness, displays laziness, or exhibits laughter or frivolity. God will not visit a person in the midst of meaningless conversation or idle chatter. Instead, God connects to people who celebrate their joy of fulfilling the commandments. This narrative perfectly illustrates the principle. Abraham entered a state of prophecy when he was completely clear-headed and occupied with kindness. He was not the least bit delusional or unstable when God arrived to speak to him, because he was in that space. He was bringing in life. That's where God is. He's not. It's the exact opposite. Every other religion says in order for you to find God, you have to go to these weird places. You got to go on a pilgrimage. That's not true in Judaism. A way in which you find God, you partner with God, is right here, right now. We are all in a position to do something amazing, something beautiful that allows us to go out and inspire humanity. Abraham rises above his namesake. He becomes not just the father of a small nation. He becomes the father of all the nations. How? By rewriting his own software. And I think that if you think about that introduction, with the end of the parsha, right? God's not mentioning his name because he becomes something more. The end of the parsha talks about what? The Akedah, where Abraham is challenged with this idea of having to sacrifice his only son. He's got to bring, and Yitzchak is well aware of it. And Abraham, this is one of the greatest challenges. He's got to go up and he's got to sacrifice his son. And Yitzchak is fully well aware of what's going on, and he says, no worries. Why is that the test for Abraham? How far, Abraham, are you willing to go to truly reflect godliness? And some people say that Abraham made a mistake, that God never asked him to sacrifice him. Pasuk says, La'alehu, I want you just to bring him up. As an olah. I never said sacrifice. You misunderstood it, which is a whole other philosophical thing. How could Abraham not get it right? But thank God at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because Yitzchak lives. Now, there are some Mefarshim that say that Yitzchak was actually died that day, that he died on the Akedah, and there's no mention of him for 3 years, and he only comes back 3 years later, and that he is the impetus for Mashiach, that Yitzchak Avinu is supposed to come back as Mashiach, as a Gilgul, to help usher in the resurrection of the dead. And he goes through that. And what Abraham was really doing at that moment from a spiritual place was trying to force the world into a messianic time. And that's why the word Yitzchak comes from the word like kitz, right? The idea of the ending, tzchok, at the end, people will laugh. Why does Yitzchak represent laughter at the end? Because when we go back and we look at our lives and we see how everything unfolded, it'll be the best comedy. I can't believe I was anxious. I can't believe I was upset. I can't believe what it. I see the whole thing planning out, and it's beautiful. It's brilliant. It's genius. We need to have faith, the same faith of Abraham. You don't worry about the challenges of the world. I said this a few weeks ago. I said to people, this is not a political statement. I said Donald Trump's going to win. I believe that Donald Trump would win because I don't believe God would save someone in such an open, miraculous way for him to lose. I also said that I think it's going to be a great year. And inshallah, it's going to be an amazing year. This time of awesomeness, of chesed, of shefa that's coming into the world is a time for you to ask yourselves, how are you going to rewrite your programming? How are you going to become more than just your name? No, Maaseh avot siman labanim. If Avraham Avinu could do it, I know, so can you. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom Barach. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great week, everybody. Kol Tuv.